welcome back to another instantiation of seminar. I believe this is our third seminar of this time around. First time we talked about Don Quixote, second time about Faust, and now about Don Giovanni, the Italian equivalent to Don Juan, the Spanish uh, uh, version of this character. And then also, as you said, as you pronounced, Wes, Don Juan in the Lord Byron English tradition.
Yes.
Good morning to you, Wes. Nice to see you again, bright and early for another
Yeah.
seminar.
Yeah.
A chance to, if we were postmodernists, I suppose, to talk about another text, though, of course, this is a strange text in that it is an opera, both a libretto and a performance, music and literature brought into one. And just one note, I'm not sure if we mentioned this last time, but it was Goethe's perspective that Mozart was the only composer worthy of setting music to Faust. And so when Mozart died, I think in the early 1820s, maybe the mid 1820s, Goethe no longer believed that there was any composer who could truly do justice to his dramatic, tragic masterpiece. Faust.
Mm.
Sort of similar, I imagine, to Alexander, or at least the story, perhaps apocryphal story of Alexander weeping for because there was no Homer to write his like there was for Achilles. But
That's beautiful.
thank you for watching this with me, taking this little intermezzo between
Mm.
the textual texts, the books, um, and being a little bit more spectacular and theatrical than literary
Yeah.
in this moment. But perhaps we'll collapse those distinctions again, like a postmodernist, though I suspect also perhaps not. How are you doing? How did you
Uh,
like this work? What did you see, my friend?
oh yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Good morning. And I really enjoy this production. I have never actually successfully watched a whole, from beginning to end opera on any device, I would say. So like I tried listening to a little bit of it when I couldn't watch it on YouTube, and then I saw the beginning and almost the very end, but as you pointed out, this production we watched like kind of cuts off with the last scene that has Don Giovanni in it, and there's actually an epilogue after that. So I missed that entirely. But I was also reading the libretto as I was going along. I had it in Italian and English, which is very handy to see like, certain words will get repeated, but they're not necessarily translated the same way every time, or there's like, puns and things going on. So it's kind of making my head explode, right? Because I also don't know much about music, as much as I've tried to kind of study music now and off and on. Um, it's something I don't have a great talent or knack for. Um, and obviously, one of the great things about this piece is the sort of spirit of lightness and energy that's so characteristic of the Mozart time period, and Mozart particularly his style, right? Um, and so to try to explicate it and break it down is already very difficult and already sort of missing the point, maybe. But I, in my ponderous way, want to see like, okay, so what are the like key themes, like musical themes that will repeat throughout the piece, and how are they changing keys or being, modified in different ways? And I just have no idea. Like there's certain arias and things that I recognize, right? They've been sort of lifted out of the opera and they get performed or played on the radio or whatever separately. And there's a lot of music from this time that gets like adapted into things like Tom and Jerry or whatever, Bugs Bunny. So like there's a lot of this that is just sort of in the air now. Um, and of course, this character, Don Giovanni, Don Juan, is a motif, a cliche almost that, is a type that we recognize. But uh, I never fully embodied him. I say I embody the Faust quite a bit. The Don Giovanni, not so much. Although I think inevitably there's pieces of our popular culture, our society now that are deeply imbued with this sort of demonic spirit of pleasure seeking or pretending to have no fear or whatever it is that sort of like defines Don Giovanni. So there's a ton here that I'm really interested in and digging into at least a little bit of it. And I don't know, maybe we start by saying, like, how does this connect with this kind of thread that we've been tracing from Quixote to Faust to Don Juan? Do you want to sort of speak to that a little bit? And maybe there's some Faust things that were left over that we could sprinkle in there?
Well, that's exactly what I would like to
Okay.
address. Uh, Wes, sorry, I'm messing with my headphones here.
You're sounding good. No worries.
Okay, okay, good. Sorry, I just kicked something and then decided to change for a moment. Sorry, let me just for 1 second. But yeah, so while you were talking, there are lots of elements that we could dig into, and as myself, not a musicologist, though someone very interested in music, yeah, what I really thought that I might try and pick apart about this work, and in particular in connection with Faust and Don Quixote, and even notes from Underground, are the ways in which this Don Giovanni is a modern character or a
Mm,
modernist character. And so, one immediate connection that suggests itself to me is that Don Giovanni, like Faust, is a pursues momentary experience in sort of an eternal way. What do I mean by that? Like, and this is partially based on, well, everything that he does, but his extolling of wine and of pleasure with women, of laying with women. And, you know, he even says, all the better if it's your Moliere, if it's your wife,
that's
to,
right.
you know, even to Leporello, his loyal servant. But what I see in both of these characters is a desire for immediacy and experience, a desire to transcend the subjective and to experience either the objective or the absolute or the whole, to have a meaningful experience that is revelatory of something beyond the fictional, the opinionated, the believable, and takes one out from one's normal sort of psychological apparatus and connects one to, well, something which may or may not even exist in the modern time. Sort of an interesting, I'd say, juxtaposition with the moderns is that while they're having so much trouble determining the relationship between faith and secularism and religiosity and sort of scientism,
Mhm.
it, they still seem to have quite a bit of faith, particularly moderns like Kant and Spinoza and Hegel, in there being some sort of absolute or transcendent reality. And so part of what I think I see is that in both Faust and Don Giovanni's case, without there being a set transcendent ideal towards which to dedicate their efforts, both of them are stuck with a sort of second best option, with just pursuing that which is temporary, which leaves you with either a shame hangover or an actual physical hangover, temporary reliefs. Very similar in some ways to the more postmodern version of Brave New World, where
Mhm.
sex and drugs are basically free and consume the vast majority of one's leisure time in that existence. But to trail it back, what I think I see as a very strong connection between Don Giovanni and Faust, and they're not the same class from what I can tell. Don Giovanni is slightly higher class, whereas
Mhm.
Faust is a more middle class, like professor, doctor type, though a very impressive one. Is that they're both seeking for something more from life, but through uh, inferior means. They are seeking for the absolute through the temporary, or they're looking for the eternal through the temporary. They are. It's as if they're struggling to find a substitute for the transcendent by looking for the transcendent in that which couldn't possibly have it, which are these sordid love affairs that lead from one to another to another to another in the case of Don Giovanni, or from one pleasure to another for Faust, whether it be sensual pleasure with Marguerite, whether it be the pleasure of spectacle and fame with the emperor, or whether it be the pleasure of being sort of a tycoon later on, where he helps to win a war with his three mighty men, and then
Mhm.
even reclaims water from the earth, as if he is, not to be crude about it, but that's almost like the ultimate rapture or rape, right? Instead of taking virginity or like the initial innocent femininity away from a woman in sort of Don Giovanni or Helen, in the case of when she was 10 with Theseus, or in the case of Hades and Persephone.
Yeah.
This is like a masculine social stealing from nature as earth, stealing from the earth spirit. And I see that also as, if we wanted to make a connection to Final Fantasy VII, which again is a postmodern, the postmodern version of this is stealing the life force out of the earth for energy, sort of similar to what I think modern people would connect to, or contemporary, our contemporaries connect to use of fossil fuels.
Interesting.
And in contemporary America and Japan and Western Europe, well, all across the world as well. And so the two things that I really think I see are a substitution of maximal experience to make up for the fact that experience is no longer meaningful or integral, and that it doesn't lead to one feeling connected to the whole in a meaningful way. And so one finds oneself constantly searching. And one of those methods of searching is to ravage and to violently take. In the same way that sort of Faust violently enters Marguerite's life and takes her innocence, though not technically a rape, it's sort of like one. He's used a love potion. He has the devil on his side. He has yet another sleeping potion there. Her autonomy, Marguerite's autonomy, is limited in this situation. And then later he will reclaim land from the water. And I wonder if that sort of violence and desire to take and reappropriate, that sort of either personal romantic imperialism on the one hand with Don Giovanni, but also sort of property and territorial imperialism, territorial, not in taking from another people, but in fact even taking from the earth itself.
Yeah.
In the Final Fantasy VII and in Faust, whether that is itself I don't know, like a negative response, a violent, subjective response to I don't know, the Earth Mother not providing that which we consider our natural dowry, or for hating the feminine because of being brought into this cruel world which doesn't fulfill its promise, or something like that. Just to start, just as a start.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting take on what we see, of course, is Don Giovanni proclaiming his love of women, right? He's almost protesting too much, right? Because he doesn't treat them very well. But in his mind, he seems genuinely to think that this is the way that he can express his wonderful sentiments of love and affection, by just sort of spreading as broadly as possible, broadcasting his affections to as many women as possible. And it doesn't work out well for him in the end, of course, but for a while there, he seems to be really having a grand time, and really seems completely unable to empathize or feel bad, shame, or as he proclaims more often about fear being the thing he can't feel. And so I wonder how much he kind of conflates those two emotions, or you know, has, at any rate, you brought up the class thing too, right? He's got a notion of himself as an individual, but also as, his status as a great person, a great man, a noble, and how he needs to maintain that at all costs, it seems. Versus, of course, Leporello, who is really sort of the voice of conscience, like a kind of Jiminy Cricket there, but full of fear, full of shame, knows that he's gonna be in for trouble if he stays with this master, and yet he sticks with him, right? He serves him faithfully to the end, or not so faithfully, but he sticks with him, right? And there's a money piece to that, right? Don Giovanni pays him. There's also maybe something more compelling about Don Giovanni, kind of magnetism that, as it attracts women, also attracts others, including Leporello. So, like thinking about the latent violence and hatred and such, like, you know, that gets expressed in Don Giovanni's case right up front in the attempted rape of Donna Anna, right? And she successfully fends him off, at least in her story.
Mhm.
And her father appears, right? The
Mhm.
commendatore,
Mhm.
another great sort of alter ego of Don Giovanni, right? He is the true nobleman, the old man, the father, and Don Giovanni kills him like on the spot. Um,
I
and
disdain you, he says in the English
I
translation.
disdain to fight you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He doesn't want to fight, but the commendatore insists, right, for the honor of his daughter, and his own families and his own. And sure enough, the younger man, you know, does him in. Um, and this sets in motion, right, a kind of um, Hamlet. I got a lot of Hamlet vibes,
Of
right?
course, right.
Because her betrothed, what's his name, Ottavio, Don Ottavio, comes in and is sworn to get vengeance, right? Before she'll
Yes.
actually marry him, right? So it's kind of a funny twist on the Hamlet thing, but it's definitely there. There's some, and speaking of modern, you know, figures of literature and you know psychology, that Hamlet figure we've got to probably deal with at some point.
Yeah,
Um,
I
yeah,
think
anyway.
so. Sometimes we talk ourselves into this is like the moment in the presentation where you realize you have to add something to the syllabus.
Let me just go back and tweak a few things. Yeah. Yeah, but there's no point in this story at which it seems like he's going to get away with it and that this violence is not going to be avenged. And there's a very strong morality to that. But on the other hand, all of the sort of energy cuts totally against that. It's all, you know, Don Giovanni is the figure that is you know, this kind of anti-hero. And so I'm interested in that tension, right? The story demands that he be punished, and yet the energy, if I can be kind of woolly about it, right, seems to be on his side. You know, he's the one that we remember, not the commendatore usually. So what's up with that? Um, that
That's a fantastic question. I think that shows an anxiety, and let's bring Hamlet into the equation in the modern imagination about morality and what ethical action is and what it nets. So in Hamlet, there's a tension between Protestantism and Catholicism. Does one's soul go immediately to purgatory and is therefore saved if one is killed while praying, like King Claudius is
Mhm.
doing, and Hamlet seems to believe? What does it mean for the former king to show up as a ghost that is in some sort of liminal space, not in heaven, not in hell? And so Hamlet is very concerned with even the eternal aspects of his uncle going to heaven. He doesn't wish him to go to heaven, and so Faust, very similarly to Don Giovanni, has all the energy on his side, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
also, like Don Giovanni and Don Quixote, has an odd couple sort of second who is not his equal in an
Yeah.
interesting way. Right? So, but it's inverted. Or Don Quixote is almost a nobleman. He's minor gentility, right? He's not a Don, but he does call himself Don.
Mhm.
This Don Giovanni is a Don. And Sancho is a peasant, and Leporello is also a peasant.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, I'm forgetting what I was going to say based on that. Um, mhm.
It's a good connection. I mean, to see the servant figure
oh
in the two
yes,
cases.
yes, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. So in any case, the servant and something about the servant with both Don Giovanni and Faust is that the servant is starts to sort of back away from the ethical action of the action of the main character. In fact,
Mhm.
right at the beginning of Don Giovanni, after the initial escapade, Leporello asks Don Giovanni to swear not to get mad at him, and Don Giovanni says he will, just in
Right.
case he doesn't mention the commendatore that he's just killed. And he says, "You're living the life of a scoundrel."
Mhm.
And eventually, he even tries to leave him. Similarly, Mephistopheles, who is the literal German devil, and is under contract with Faust to help him experience anything necessary until he demands two Augenblicke and says, "Du bist so schön." He he starts to run out of ideas even by act four of part two of Faust, and he's like, well, what is it that you want? What are you striving for? He
Hmm.
it is as if both of these modern characters, Faust and Don Giovanni, are neither of them, like you said, the force of the narrative is on both of their sides. Like there is a certain, I mean, and especially in the edition that we watched with Don Giovanni, played by Rodney Guilford, he's a very handsome character,
Oh
and
yeah.
so besides him being having a beautiful operatic voice and being very well dressed and also being an extremely just attractive character, the music itself leads us forward alongside him. So there are all of these, and similarly with Faust, but like you said, both of them become entrenched in their sort of amorality or immorality. They can. There is no hint that either of them is going to repent and be saved. And so like you said, the momentum is on their side, but it's clearly leading in one direction. At some
Hmm.
point they're mostly what is there's an immovable object and a super
Unstoppable force.
unstoppable force.
Yeah.
They are very similar to unstoppable forces during the entirety of their dramatic sequences until the end. And at the end, I think is where you see one of the larger connections between them, which is that one is drawn down into hell, and the other is apotheosized into heaven. And in fact, helped along by the eternal feminine and Margarita, the woman that Faust, in a Don Giovanni like way, as an upper class man with a lower class woman, sort of despoiled and to some extent ruined her life and was complicit in the death of several of her family members, including her brother, daughter, and mother. But Faust is saved,
Yeah.
whereas
It's
Don
weird.
Giovanni is damned. I agree with you that both of them double down. Both of them move almost in an unadulterated, unimpeded way with ultimate momentum throughout their stories, just to come to a crashing halt at the end. But Faust saved, Don Giovanni damned. Why do you, I mean, if this analysis is on base that they both move with a similar sort of momentum and the story itself does not stop them, but it is the conclusion that reveals to them the weight of their actions, then did they act in the same way, or did they act fundamentally differently, or is there some sort of fundamental difference that I'm missing
Hmm.
between um between the ultimate evaluations of their deeds?
I think that's a really important moment uh in the, to look to the end, right? As I think Solon says, right, in
Oh
Aristotle's.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh right. So there's like the no that Don Giovanni utters when he's told to repent by the commendatory's spirit, statue, whatever it is that's there,
Yes.
right? He doubles down, triples down, infinitely repeats his no, and it's too late for him. But he's been told before then, as you point out, right? Leporello has told him, Donna Elvira has told him, all along the way, he's been invited, cajoled, pursued, he's pursued in turn, and at no point will he turn, convert, repent. It's impossible for him, it seems, um, to because he would stop being Don Giovanni, I guess. And so on the other hand, Faust having his kind of trajectory, which is a bit different, right? A bit more intellectual, right? Reflective is a word that I think Kierkegaard used. I'm heavily influenced here by Kierkegaard's Either Or, which I've read not too long ago, although it's been a while. And he's got a lot of thinking about this exact question, like the immediate, the immediacy, the pursuit of feeling or something like that, and then the reflective, the
Mm.
intellectual, the spiritual. He's very much in this dialectical mode in that work, of course, as he must be. Anyway, so there's something about the way in which Faust is able to, you know, be open to others' pity for him. You know, this is a very Dante and Beatrice kind of vibe that I'm getting too, where it's somebody that he loved, who in turn is coming back to kind of save him. Um, that idea is, I think, absent from Don Giovanni's vocabulary, right? The idea that someone else could do something for him on that scale, he's the one who's dispersing the good, right? He's the one who's livening things up, and I don't know that that he would be the Don Giovanni figure once he didn't, do that anymore. It's kind of like how Don Quixote, once he stops believing in his adventures, dies, right? He cannot sort of um, relinquish the qualities that made him the character he was and go on living. That's the end of the story for him. So I don't know if the idea of grace or forgiveness is there in his repertoire in Don Giovanni's case, whereas it is for those other, for you Don Quixote, yes, for sure, and for Faust there at the very end, just by a hair, he's saved. So
I think that's a really good response. And something else I'm wondering is Don Giovanni in some ways is very like Faust, but he also reminds me quite a bit of Mephistopheles, the spirit that negates. Even that
demonic.
at the beginning of his name, May, the non-real negator in Greek, not like Metis, nobody, in the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
And Don Giovanni, no, 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 is what he yells at the end. Interestingly, that is what we hear women, at least I think twice in
Mm-hmm.
in the play, yell at him. So one thing about him is it's as if he is a representation of radical autonomy and agency. That
Mm-hmm.
he, like Faust objectifies that which he desires because he pursues it as an object of desire, whether it be a land or a woman, or whether it be even the ideal woman. And so it is as if Don Giovanni, in his refusal of, in his, it is as if he, like a modern or even like a romantic, wishes to eschew the natural, wishes to punish women for their reproductive faculty because reproduction suggests a lack of autonomy on one's part. A, because one doesn't bring oneself into being, one is brought into being by a father and mother, and B, because insofar as there is reproduction, there is death. And what is a more radical restriction on one's autonomy and agency than the fact that one is mortal and cannot extend one's life indefinitely? And so
Mm-hmm.
Don Giovanni seems to be experiencing at the end the same sort of rape in losing his life as he was in trying to impose on the world, and in trying to impose his will on the world and not be imposed on at all. He finally experiences just how much of a false representation or a superstitious representation or an ineffectual set of gestures those were in
Yeah.
trying to assert his ultimate autonomy and agency over the world and over the feminine representatives in the world. All he does is shows his own impotence, and this is also something he's, I think, to some extent literally showing, right? Because we
Yeah.
don't hear about Don Giovanni having many children.
No.
1,003 lovers in Spain, and yet this is not a comedy about inheritance and all the problems that
Right.
go alongside it. But my second piece of this dident, I guess I would say, this pitchfork, as it were, is that I think it might be possible that Faust is saved because though he is also attempting to demonstrate his own radical autonomy, he accidentally does good. in the
Hmm.
same way that Mephistopheles does good without intending to. He he thinks about the fact that he's made this city and it will do good for multitudes of people. That is not what made him make the city in the first place. He was simply demanding that he wanted land from this emperor and is in fact given water that he has to pump. It is accidental to the situation that he does that A, he does good, and B, that he recognizes that he does good, and this is what kills him. Whereas Don Giovanni, I think he doesn't, far more like Mephistopheles. He knows that he's trying to do bad, but perhaps he does good in the end,
Yeah. Yeah.
by being himself a symbol for justice prevailing in the end or something.
There's
Like,
this
yeah,
mention of Pluto and Persephone. It's like
yes,
one of the very last things there. And yeah, he's very much the Persephone figure here. That's really, as much as he's been the pursuer, he's ultimately pursued and caught. Yeah. Yeah.
that's, yeah, take my hand, and he's so instead of him being taken up to heaven and assumed into heaven, the hand he takes drags him down to the flames.
Right.
But I wonder to what extent that says something about ethical action among modern heroes. Don Quixote seems to act for our amusement, acts in a sort of deluded fashion. Faust, um, he he seems to, well, he either suffers from a series of delusions or from one grand delusion, which is that his, which is perhaps our grand delusion, which is that if he makes a pact with the devil, things will work out. I mean, that
Right.
seems to be that premise itself is sort of a poisoned premise, right? That
Yes.
once he makes that pact, all that we read, that nothing, I mean, except insofar as Mephistopheles intends to do bad but does good, we are going to see a lot of bad intent on his part that ends up doing some sort of good at the end. But I mean, there's a lot of death and perhaps even innocent death. I mean, Bacchus and Philemon at the end, Margarita slash Gretchen, even poor Euphorion and Helen must die again, or Euphorion for the first time, but Helen for she's been like a zombie revivified and put back to death many times. Cervantes would be appalled
Sorry.
at how many times this literary character has been brought back to life. He would insist that her original author, perhaps Homer, probably someone before him, put her back in the ground. But what I'm wondering is, there doesn't seem to be a coherent set of mechanisms or actions that lead towards a coherent system of ethical action.
Hmm.
To me, there still seems to be a flattening of ideals and values, which makes it so that one can only act in a deluded way and be observed as acting in a sort of deluded way and almost in a random way, like Don Quixote, and that
Hmm.
it's almost random, which is, this is almost a language of religiosity, right? That one cannot determine who God will save and who will not serve, or and who will not be saved by God in a sort of irrationalist way. Well, which modern heroes are going to be saved? Don Quixote dies sort of ignominiously, but he does come back to his wits. Does that mean he's saved? Faust is literally saved. Don Giovanni is literally damned, and but they, particularly Faust and Don Giovanni, seem to only act in their own self-interests and not for the interests of others. And it only is incidental to Faust pursuing his own self-interest that he does the good that seems to save him. And so,
Yeah.
could Don Giovanni continued on this sort of listless, single focus life where he pursues objectifying his loves over and over and over again and mistakenly have done good?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
is this the basis for a relativistic way of looking at morality, that none of these are heroes, they are simply protagonists, and they simply exist on this like what William James called it, what, like this sort of inert rock.
Hmm.
And had they not existed, there would be no such thing as ethics. And even with them existing, well, ethics may just be an epiphenomenon of these conscious characters themselves existing, but perhaps they could just, like waiting for Godot, sit around and do nothing. Perhaps like Don Giovanni, they can just pursue women and inglorious action, or like Don Quixote, they could just make up an ideal that never existed, which they pursue, which eventually causes them so much shame that they die. Um, uh, what so I'm having
Mm,
trouble calling any of these characters heroes because I'm not
mm,
sure what their telos is. I mean, I know that they pursue some sort of subjective ideal, but I'm not seeing a that is a subjective ideal. It's not a transcendental ideal that exists, or an objective ideal which exists in the world. And so I still wonder whether, one might as well just be one flew over the cuckoo's nest. One might just as well be in the insane asylum,
mm, mm,
or out fighting the war, sort of like in a very famous French, or not a very famous French movie, but a very good French movie that I like called the King of Hearts, where it's
mm,
World War I, and actually Adolf Hitler is a character, um, and these insane asylum people from France escape into a city, and there's a parallel drawn between who's truly insane: the soldiers who are fighting, or
mm.
the insane people. And that parallel, I think, is apropos to what we're wondering with these heroes. What is it that they strive towards? What can
Mhm,
be
mhm,
heroic? And can there even be a such thing as like a communal or general ideal, if these people are just pursuing that which is subjectively good, but ultimately not very good, at least in the case of Don Giovanni. And perhaps with Faust, it's still unclear what he did to deserve grace,
mhm,
to
mhm.
me. Um, uh, but I would
Yeah.
like to have clarity on that. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think there's a question there, yeah, whether it's possible to deserve grace, right? Is it his actions? Is it the good that comes out of them at all? Or is it just the predestination or the system, right? The occluded, hidden system behind the scenes working its way towards whatever it is that has been planned from the start, right? Um, because that question of faith and works is at the heart of the like wars of religion that that story comes shortly after, and that sort of schisms down through Europe around the same time as the wonderful printing press comes on the scene. All of that seems wrapped up in this idea of the modern. Absolutely. I want to say in Don Giovanni's case that if we see good come out of it, we could see it in the form of the lesson that the audience learns, right? That the epilogue kind of speaks to. It could be seen in the sort of like negative, right? In the sense of this is a model of what not to do, and here's the bad things that happen. I think that's a little simplistic, but I think that's there. And on the other hand, we could see, yes, a communal good in the form of these other characters who are brought together. And again, that's a little bit, kumbaya, but it's also kind of there, right? There's this idea that as much as he's betrayed each of them, and many times in some cases repeatedly, they've offered, forgiveness in the case of Elvira. Leporello has offered service, even to the point of maybe practically dying for him. It's a kind of like taking on his form for a while there and almost being killed. And then in the case of Donna Anna, the Commendatore's family, her betrothed Ottavio, there's this idea of honor that's sort of like is preserved in a weird way, like she escapes him, which seems like unthinkable, right? She gets away from Don Giovanni. Um, it's this case of like the friendship that Ottavio thought they had has been betrayed, and so he's led to kind of think about friendship where he never reflected on it before, and we again are led to think about honor and the possibility of communal versus just subjective self-interest or value even being a thing. So it sort of spurs the desire for exactly what you're talking about, transcendent operations of grace and meaning, and we want those things very badly, more than we even want vengeance, I think. Although it's easy to say that having never experienced something quite this bad. But yeah, that's where I go, thinking about your dident, your dilemma there. I I again have a fairly optimistic outlook, and I don't feel truly the abyss of the absurd or the postmodern, or maybe even the modern, because I still have a certain naive faith, I think, in these matters. So as much as I'd like to think that I've thought these things through and that these literature examples and these hero anti-hero protagonists like help us process all this, it might just be my subjective, take on things, but I do think there's value here beyond just entertainment, right? As much as this is a fun thing to watch and enjoyable, there are certain lessons, and they're not quite as trite as they might appear at first glance. So when I ultimately look at these kind of modern characters, I do see reflections of myself, and I also sort of catch glimpses of the ways that we are still connected. There is still some kind of communal goal or telos. It's just difficult to what accept now. I don't know, something like that.
Maybe even to see and to
Hmm.
even believe in the existence of. So something you're making me think of is that possibly one aspect of the modern contra and postmodern is that there is a certain natural reaction in the world, possibly the social world as an extension of the natural world, that, like in physics, creates a certain reaction. So one acts in such a way within society over and over again that one creates a certain amount of, like, say, malignant will in others that necessitates a certain action. And so perhaps something about the modern age and its transition from transcendent values provided by religion to a more secular society is that the basis for such feelings of for such collective feelings of ill will towards an actor is philosophically subverted,
Hmm.
but at a human communal level doesn't seem to be subverted at all. So even if marriage is protected not simply civilly, but say religiously, and is supposed to be something that is not trespassed upon, and perhaps civilly and religiously, the autonomy of the will of a woman should
Hmm.
be respected. And yet these modern characters are not respecting these things precisely because they are sort of they are philosophical in that they no longer accept the fundamental civil and religious premises underlying communal engagement. The and it is true that the philosophical principle, insofar as there being a transcendent divinity that punishes or rewards ethical or unethical action, is brought into question at this time. But even in being brought into question, that doesn't make the actions that are based on it, those actions are themselves, they still net similar consequences to when the philosophical foundations underlying those actions were still stable,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I think perhaps in the postmodern age, and this is something I imagine move into at some point. I think that reaction might be limited or stunted because there's even less because there's a second thought, right? Not only is there so even if there is a sort of social reaction to a certain way of acting in a traditionally unethical way, the second thought is not to observe the mounting reactionary force, but to then question why there should be a
Mm.
mounting reactionary force. It's like, well, if we philosophically no longer believe in this, and yet we all feel that this man is committing evil deeds, but the foundation for even calling something evil is gone, and perhaps we need to interrogate our own feelings, right? Instead of interrogating one's thoughts because of the feelings that don't accord with one's thoughts, one then needs to bring one's feeling in line with one's thinking. In some ways, it seems almost like a reversal. It's like, well, your natural feelings are in the wrong. They
Mhm.
should You should feel differently.
Yeah.
But that is probably my better point. My other point, just because I know that we have to touch on this because we've said we're going to touch on this, is that I think that there's an interesting question of identity and mixture of identity in Don Giovanni between Leporello and Don Giovanni, particularly near the end when Leporello is made to take on the identity of Don Giovanni, wear his clothes, and lay with Elvira, which apparently he does,
Hmm.
and then he is going to be killed as Don Giovanni. And so there's a certain taking, there is at least the taking on of the identity of Don Giovanni by Leporello in a similar way to Cloud taking on the identity of Zach Fair.
Yeah, yeah.
That he does not have the skill necessary, probably even the looks necessary, though all anime video game characters look pretty good. Now I guess in these days they can look uglier than others, but they often look, better than non-animated figures. And so in a similar way to Leporello taking on the identity of Don Giovanni, and then even acting in a similar way to him and almost enduring the same fate as he does, so does Cloud take on a similar role with Zach, but he also does not live out the same fate as Zach in the same way that Leporello and I'm still working this through, perhaps in admitting that he is Leporello and that he did have a role in Don Giovanni's actions. Well, it is while he is telling his story that he escapes. It's
Yes.
not that his story is accepted that helps him to escape. It is the fact that he is telling a story and then escapes. And so in any case, there is a mixture of identities, but and a sort of transmission of identity, but also an incomplete transmission of identity between the characters that I see as a similarity, even if not an extraordinary similarity between Leporello and Don Giovanni and Cloud, Strife, and Zach Fair, and which is itself perhaps just a representation of what we've already seen with Don Quixote and Sancho and Faust and Mephistopheles, which is that influences run in at least two directions. But I just wanted to mention that because I know that I didn't mention my connection between Faust and Final Fantasy last time, and how Faust pursues a real figure of the divine feminine in Marguerite, and a sort of and also an idealized version in Helen, in the same way that I think that Cloud pursues the idealized feminine in Aerie, real feminine in Tifa. Okay, finally got it in there.
There it is.
Well, also, of course, living in a world that is transitioning from reliance on magic to reliance on science.
Interesting.
Final Fantasy VII, magic is still used, but in a scientific way. It is the materia is what hardened Mako, which is itself the life stream of the literal life stream of the planet, which in Final Fantasy VI and VII, machines are used in order to derive energy from those, and sometimes monsters.
Yeah, that's a lot that I will have to muse on and chew on here. That's a really cool connection between Faust and Final Fantasy VII. One that I think we'll have to kind of put in conversation with the other things we were saying about how there's this like need to tell more stories or something like that, right? The idea of an identity or a role being transmitted, and the idea of stories being transmitted. I feel like you were kind of saying that about Leporello, even in the act of storytelling as well, right? Which makes me think of Scheherazade, the 1001 Nights, right? Her storytelling being an act of self-preservation and of saving the king, right, from his own worse self. So there's really something interesting there. I wanted to throw out, as you're talking about that, a very classical example of this in the Achilles Patroclus, right? Patroclus donning the honor, taking on the role of Achilles. Yeah, so that's another thing maybe we could look at. But my time here is up for today. So next time, is it Hamlet? Is it Underground? What do you want to do next week?
Well, maybe let's start with Notes from Underground, because I think we'll have a strong connection between books, literature, and being several times. So one time in Don Giovanni, we hear the expression, "You speak as if you're in a book," or "as if you were a book." Those expressions proliferate in Notes from Underground. They're constant references saying that this character speaks like he's from a book. And
Hmm.
there is a literariness, a conscious literariness to the text, and also the idea that stories or books can perhaps illuminate, but also perhaps drive one insane.
Words, words, words.
Word,
Yes. Okay,
word.
there we go.
All
All
right.
right.
Thank you, my friend. I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
our next visit with each other.
Sounds good. Thank you.